In June 1904, a worker at a Chicago meatpacking plant fell into an industrial rendering vat. By the accounts of those who witnessed it, there wasn't enough left to recover before the batch was processed and labeled for sale. The company said nothing publicly. A journalist named Upton Sinclair was inside that plant, taking notes on everything he saw, and what he eventually published changed food regulation across the entire Western world. But the industry he exposed had already been running unchecked for 30 years, turning cattle into cash and workers into disposable parts of the same machine. This is the history of steak. It built fortunes, bought political power, and quietly shaped what success looks like on a plate. The question nobody asks is how a single cut of beef became the most loaded status symbol in human history. Comment your go-to steak order right now, because this video reveals a scandal connected directly to the cut you're thinking of, coming up before the halfway mark. Long before any steakhouse existed, long before any butcher had a name for a ribeye or a sirloin, the animal behind every steak was something no modern diner would have recognized or wanted to meet. The Orox, the wild ancestor of modern cattle, stood nearly 6 feet tall at the shoulder, weighed over 1,000 kilograms, and had horns spanning up to 3 feet across. Roman emperors reportedly hunted them in the Hercynian forest of Central Europe specifically because the danger involved made the kill prestigious. Verify specific Roman hunting accounts. Julius Caesar himself described the Orox in his account of the Gallic Wars, writing about its near-impossible strength and the bragging rights attached to bringing one down. Nobody domesticated the Orox because they wanted a convenient source of steak. The process of taming wild cattle, believed to have begun around 8000 BCE in the Near East, specifically in a region now covering parts of modern Turkey and Iran, took generations and carried enormous personal danger for the farmers involved. Verified domestication date and region. Early domesticated cattle were kept primarily for labor, pulling plows and carrying loads, with their meat a secondary and relatively rare bonus. The idea of eating beef regularly, let alone eating a specific cut of it prepared to a specific temperature, would have seemed absurd, an enormous waste of a working animal. Here is the detail that foreshadows everything that follows. Once humans began selectively breeding cattle for docility and size rather than wild survival instinct, they created an animal almost completely dependent on human management for its existence. The Orox went extinct in 1627, the last known individual dying in a Polish forest. Verify. What replaced it was an animal perfectly engineered for human use, and for that exact reason, one perfectly positioned to be turned into a commodity, priced, graded, sold, and fought over across the centuries that followed. That commodification didn't happen slowly or gently. It happened fast, backed by conquest, railroad money, and, when necessary, political power that treated an entire continent's grasslands as raw material for a single industry. And it started with a very specific group of people who realized, sometime in the 19th century, that controlling the beef supply meant controlling something much larger. Beef eating spread across the ancient world unevenly, shaped almost entirely by which cultures could afford to keep cattle alive long enough to slaughter them for food rather than keeping them working. In medieval Europe, fresh beef was a luxury almost exclusively available to the nobility and the church, who had the landholdings necessary to maintain large herds year-round. A peasant farmer might taste beef once or twice a year at most, usually at a feast connected to a religious calendar or a landlord's generosity, and even then it was likely a tough, old, retired draft animal rather than anything a modern diner would recognize as a proper steak. The moment that changed everything came not from a chef, but from a combination of geography and transportation technology. The vast grasslands of the American Great Plains, stretching from Texas north through Kansas and Nebraska, turned out to be almost perfectly suited for large-scale cattle ranching, a combination of climate, grass variety, and sheer acreage that no European ranching tradition had ever encountered at the same scale. By the 1860s and 1870s, the long cattle drive era was moving tens of thousands of animals north from Texas toward railroad heads in Kansas, where refrigerated rail cars, a genuinely new technology at the time, could carry dressed beef carcasses from the Midwest to eastern cities before spoilage. Verify specific dates of refrigerated rail adoption. Think about what that meant for a working-class family in New York or Boston in 1880. For the first time in history, beef, real beef, was available at a price an ordinary industrial worker could occasionally afford, not as a festival luxury, but as a regular purchase from a local butcher. Steak didn't immediately become a status symbol at that point. First, it became democratic, suddenly accessible to people who had never had realistic access to fresh beef before. The status came later, once an industry grew large enough to start grading, pricing, and marketing different cuts specifically to separate who could afford what. That industry had a name, a headquarters, and one of the darkest labor records in American history. And it was about to build something no single food industry had ever built before. By the 1880s, 5 companies had come to dominate American beef processing so completely that federal investigators would later refer to them collectively as the Beef Trust, a cartel-level arrangement controlling prices paid to ranchers, prices charged to retailers, and working conditions inside their plants, all at once. Verify, Beef Trust, terminology, and period. The most powerful among them, Swift and Company, founded by Gustavus Swift, had pioneered the use of refrigerated railcars in the 1870s specifically to bypass the existing cattle shipping industry and control the entire chain from slaughter to sale under a single roof. Verify Swift's specific refrigerated rail innovation timeline. Gustavus Swift's operation and its major competitors, Armour, Morris, National Packing, and Schwarzschild and Sulzberger, collectively processed a staggering share of the American beef supply from their enormous Chicago facilities. The Union Stockyards, which at their peak covered roughly a square mile of the city's south side and employed tens of thousands of workers. Verify specific acreage and workforce figures at peak operation. The stockyards didn't just process animals. They were an entire city within a city, with their own banks, hotels, newspapers, and telegraph offices, all oriented around the movement of cattle through what one contemporary writer called the greatest killing operation in human history. Working conditions inside those plants were what Upton Sinclair came to document in 1904 and 1905, embedded undercover as a laborer. The workers he described, mostly recent immigrants from Eastern Europe, Lithuania, Poland, and Slovakia in the largest numbers, worked 10 to 14-hour days in conditions designed entirely around speed of throughput rather than human safety. Verify Sinclair's research methodology and worker demographics. Injuries were routine and largely uncompensated. Meat that failed inspection was routinely relabeled rather than discarded. According to Sinclair's accounts and subsequent government investigation, Verify specific fraud practices. Sick or dying animals were processed and sold. Sinclair's book, The Jungle, published in February 1906, caused a public reaction that moved faster than almost any consumer scandal in American history up to that point. President Theodore Roosevelt, reportedly disgusted by what he read, ordered a federal investigation almost immediately. The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act both passed in June 1906. Within months of the book's publication, Verify exact dates. For the first time, the American federal government had real authority to inspect commercial meat before it reached the public. Here is the absurd footnote that still shapes what you pay for steak today. The USDA beef grading system, which assigns cuts the labels prime, choice, and select, was not initially a purely independent government creation. The grading standards were developed with significant input from industry representatives who had obvious financial incentives in defining where the lines between grades fell. Verify degree of industry involvement in original grading development. Prime beef, graded on marbling levels that only a small percentage of cattle naturally achieve, was essentially defined in a way that kept the top grade artificially scarce. Scarcity means premium pricing. Premium pricing means status. And status, once attached to a specific grade of steak, is almost impossible to remove. The industry had survived Sinclair. It had survived federal inspection. It had adapted to regulation the same way it adapted to everything else, by making the regulation work in its favor wherever possible. That adaptation looked like a victory, but a much larger threat was already building, and this one didn't come from a journalist, a president, or a labor movement. It came from biology. The structural weakness in the beef industry has always been the same one planted at the very beginning. Unlike grain crops, which can be stored, shipped in bulk, and rotated through multiple species or varieties relatively quickly, cattle production operates on a biological timeline that can't be rushed. A cow takes roughly 2 years from birth to market weight. A disease outbreak in a cattle population can't be contained the way a crop pest can, because the animals move, spread, and share enclosed air and water in feedlots packed tightly together specifically for efficiency of scale. The most devastating demonstration of that vulnerability came in Britain in the 1990s with the outbreak of bovine spongiform encephalopathy, known as BSE, or more commonly as mad cow disease. The disease had been incubating in the British cattle industry for years before anyone outside a small group of veterinary researchers understood what it was, spread through a practice of feeding cattle ground-up remains of other cattle and sheep in the form of cheap protein supplement, a practice adopted across the industry in the 1970s and 1980s to lower feed costs. Verify BSE origins and feed practice timeline. By 1993, when the British government publicly confirmed that BSE could potentially transfer to humans through contaminated beef consumption, causing a fatal brain condition called variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, the damage to public trust in beef was catastrophic, and not only in Britain. Verify 1993 timeline and official confirmation details. The European Union banned British beef exports entirely in 1996. Verify exact ban date. Approximately 4.4 million cattle were slaughtered in Britain's emergency cull between 1996 and 1998. Verify cull figures. The economic cost to the UK beef industry ran into billions of pounds. Verify specific economic damage estimates. The scramble for a solution involved something important. The industry didn't fundamentally rethink the centralized, efficiency-first feeding and processing model that had created the vulnerability in the first place. It banned specific feed practices. It implemented traceability systems. But the basic structure of large-scale concentrated animal feeding operations, thousands of cattle packed into small areas and processed through centralized facilities, remained because the economic logic that created it hadn't changed. And here is the same mistake twice, echo hidden in the fix. The modern industrialized beef supply chain, increasingly concentrated in a small number of enormous processing facilities, discovered its own version of that fragility in April 2020, when COVID-19 outbreaks ripped through American meatpacking plants, forcing closures at facilities responsible for a significant share of the country's entire beef processing capacity in a matter of weeks. Verify 2020 meatpacking COVID impact and specific facility closure data. For companies, JBS, Tyson, Cargill, and National Beef process roughly 80% of American beef. Verify current market concentration figures. When their facilities close, the supply chain doesn't flex. It breaks. Today, the global beef industry generates roughly $700 billion in annual economic activity when all related sectors are counted. Verify global beef industry market size. The United States alone produces over 25 billion pounds of beef per year, making it the world's largest beef producer. Verify current U.S. production figures. That production is still more concentrated in fewer hands than almost any other major food category in the country, with the four-company dominance that became visible during the 2020 pandemic closures largely unchanged since. Verify current market concentration. The modern version of the status problem is a new one. Climate science has established that beef production accounts for a disproportionate share of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, primarily through methane from cattle digestion and land use changes required to support large-scale grazing and feed crop production. Verify specific emissions percentage attributed to beef versus other agriculture. This has created a class tension around steak that has no real historical precedent. For the first time, eating an expensive, high-quality steak carries an environmental stigma in some cultural contexts that its price tag cannot fully offset. Lab-grown beef, cultured directly from cattle cells without raising or slaughtering an animal, received regulatory approval in the United States for commercial sale in 2023, making it the first country to formally allow cultivated meat to be sold to consumers. Verify exact 2023 approval details and current commercial availability. Whether cultivated beef will ever replicate the specific texture and flavor profile of a traditionally aged, naturally raised cut of beef at a price that makes commercial sense remains genuinely unresolved, and most scientists working in this space describe the timeline to meaningful market scale as uncertain at best. Verify current state of cultivated beef market development. The same industry that survived Sinclair, survived BSE, and survived a pandemic supply chain collapse is now being asked to survive a reckoning with its own environmental footprint, whether it adapts or not. One thing about steak's history is consistent across every era. The people with the least power in the system have always absorbed the most cost when things go wrong. Steak's entire history is really the history of the same trade-off made again and again. Concentrate production, maximize efficiency, reduce cost, grow enormous. Then watch a single point of failure, a disease, a pandemic, a public scandal, bring the whole concentrated system to its knees faster than any distributed, resilient alternative ever could. The same logic that put tens of thousands of cattle in a single Chicago yard in 1880 put 80% of American beef processing under 4 companies in 2020. The same cost-cutting instinct that fed cattle to cattle in Britain in the 1970s created a disease that cost the country billions by the 1990s. Every time the industry has faced a crisis, it has patched the specific failure and left the underlying structure intact, because the underlying structure is where the profit lives. That's not unique to beef. It's the template for how most large-scale food systems work. Steak is just the example that comes with 150 years of unusually well-documented disasters to learn from, if anyone chooses to. Behind every abstract statistic about market concentration and emissions targets are people whose entire economic reality depends on an industry they largely didn't design and can't individually change. In the Great Plains states, cattle ranching remains one of the primary economic activities for rural communities across Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, communities where independent ranchers increasingly find themselves squeezed between the price processors are willing to pay and the cost of feed, land, and veterinary care required to run a viable operation. Verify specific economic pressure data on independent ranchers. The COVID-era plant closures in 2020 exposed something those communities already knew. When processing capacity concentrates into enormous facilities run by a handful of companies, independent ranchers become almost entirely price takers rather than price setters, with limited ability to find alternative buyers if a single major processor drops their price or closes temporarily. During the 2020 closures, some ranchers reported being unable to sell market-ready cattle at any price, while beef retail prices rose simultaneously, a gap so stark it triggered congressional investigations into whether the processing companies used the crisis to expand their own profit margins at both ends of the supply chain. Verify specific 2020 rancher reports and congressional investigation details. Meanwhile, the workers inside those processing facilities, still disproportionately immigrant and minority communities as they were in Sinclair's time, absorbed the highest personal health risk during the pandemic outbreaks, often in facilities where the physical layout of close quarters cutting lines made social distancing effectively impossible. Verify specific demographic data on current meatpacking workforce. The steak on a restaurant plate carries none of that context. It arrives in silence. Picture someone tonight at a steakhouse or sitting down to a home-grilled piece of beef, cutting into a medium-rare ribeye without a single thought about the rendering vat in a Chicago plant in 1904, or the cattle dying from an undiagnosed brain disease in Britain 90 years later, or the rancher in Kansas who couldn't find a buyer for market-ready cattle while the supermarket price rose around him. None of that history arrives on the plate. It has been carefully separated from the product through 150 years of packaging, branding, grading systems, and restaurant atmospherics designed to make a cut of beef feel like uncomplicated pleasure. Steak became a status symbol not because it tasted better than everything else, though many people believe it does, but because every system built around it, the grading, the aging, the specific cuts reserved for the expensive menu, and the specific cuts ground up for the cheap one, was designed to make certain beef feel exclusive, aspirational, worth paying more for. That design wasn't an accident. It was, and still is, the entire point. Every steak carries a price in the restaurant, in the supply chain, and in the land and air used to produce it. Most of that price is invisible until someone finally looks. Upton Sinclair wrote, "The jungle, specifically to expose the suffering of immigrant workers in meatpacking plants and spark a socialist labor movement. Instead, it triggered food safety legislation and changed beef inspection policy, a reform he never intended and reportedly considered a failure of his actual point." Verify Sinclair's own stated reaction to the book's reception. The workers he wrote about got regulations around the meat they processed. They didn't get the wages or rights he went in to advocate for. That gap between what people think changed and what actually changed is the real hidden history of steak. So here is a simple question. If the USDA's prime grading system was redesigned from scratch tomorrow, without any industry involvement, do you think prime would stay as rare and expensive as it is? Drop your answer in the comments. And if uncovering what's actually behind the things people consume every day without questioning them is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe, because that's exactly what this channel does every single week.